Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. This week on the show, we're taking a look at the multitude of angles that the Trump administration has taken in its attacks on immigrants as a testing ground for authoritarian control, how we got to this point, and what efforts are being made to push back. Joining me to discuss this is the program director at Detention Watch Network, Stacy Suh. But first, these headlines. We are definitely grateful and relieved this week to see images and video coming out of Gaza of Palestinians celebrating a new ceasefire deal. The initial stage of this agreement is a mutual release of hostages and an increase in the humanitarian aid that will be allowed to enter the Gaza Strip. The U.S. military will be taking a key role in monitoring the ceasefire, and Trump is apparently going to be the chair of a quote-unquote Board of Peace overseeing a Palestinian Transitional Committee. This Board of Peace also perplexingly includes former UK Prime Minister and George W. Bush hype man Tony Blair. Sure. Another notable point is that the agreement includes a, quote, Trump development plan, which feels a little ominous, even though the agreement explicitly states that nobody will be forced to leave the Strip and that those who have left will be allowed to return. A lot depends on the coming weeks and months, as much in the agreement hinges on Hamas agreeing to the proposal and Gaza becoming a, quote, terror-free area. It's not lost on me that the person who's defining what's terror-free is also Donald Trump, the same guy who's defining domestic dissent in the country he's the president of as, quote, terrorism. So as we celebrate with the people of Palestine, we know that the work is far from over. Ceasefire has always been the bare minimum. Over the past week, resistance to ICE overreach and National Guard deployment to the Chicago area also continued. Protesters have continued to monitor ICE activity in Broadview, their current base of operations, and ICE agents continue to escalate matters by calling in false police reports, attacking protesters, and generally making life miserable in the neighborhood for everyday people. In response, a lot of those everyday people have shown up for their neighbors, documenting and preventing ICE arrests by organizing school-based accompaniment programs to make sure kids and their parents get to school safely every morning, and the Coalition Against the Trump Agenda, which includes the Chicago Teachers Union and United Working Families, also led a march on Thursday to turn people out into the streets. Meanwhile, a federal judge granted a temporary restraining order blocking Trump's troop deployment, stating that there was, quote, no credible evidence that there has been rebellion in the state. Trump, meanwhile, threatened to arrest both Mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois. Mayor Brandon Johnson responded, saying the president is, quote, unstable and unhinged. Trump has also turned his attention to Portland, Oregon, where residents in inflatable character costumes have been spotted almost every night, turning up to protest a threatened National Guard deployment to that city. While a U.S. district judge issued a restraining order preventing deployment, the city is waiting to see if a three-judge panel from the Ninth Circuit overrules it to carry the plan forward. Finally, on Thursday, indictment charges were filed against New York Attorney General Letitia James, not because of any mounting evidence in an alleged mortgage fraud case, but purely an indictment based on the personal malice of the President of the United States. James is the state attorney general responsible for New York's criminal investigations against Trump and his organizations, which resulted in $355 million in fines and barred Trump and his organizations from doing business in the state for 3 years. Like I said, this is pretty obviously a completely personal and politically motivated attack on an individual member of the judicial branch, which has become a trend of his administration and other authoritarians in the past. Reports from federal prosecutors indicate that many of them are hesitant to take these kinds of cases, and the administration has had to dig pretty deep to get this case to move forward at all. While this and the indictment of James Comey, who, may I remind you, handed him the 2016 election a week out from Election Day, are alarming, the execution here has frankly been pretty stupid. Trump's boisterous style of moving past and breaking things could well catch up to him in this instance. For example, late last month, he openly posted on social media a request for his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to pursue his political opponents, naming James in particular and stating, quote, we can't delay any longer. It's killing our reputation and credibility. So while these indictments are not likely to get very far, the precedent being set is chaotic and dangerous, to say the least. Republican Senator Tom Tillis even stated, whatever threshold gets set here is the new floor for future prosecutions when the roles are reversed, which is a fair warning of the danger of this style of back-and-forth lawfare, but also a threat for the future that when Trump leaves office, while still holding cultural influence over his base, charges that might be brought against him for the many crimes that he's currently committing may actually contribute to widening the divide between his partisans and the rest of us.
Hey everybody, this is Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. I read and give to Convergence because it has become a home for me to engage in critical analysis, find practical advice for organizing and strategy, and inspiration in the belief that a better world is not only possible, we can build it.
To make either a one-time donation or become a sustaining member, visit convergencemag.com/donate. You can find a direct link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.
The Trump administration's approach to immigration enforcement is extremely chaotic, violent, and frankly a bit incoherent. It also happens to be one of their largest, most dangerous, and spectacular efforts, carried out by both federal agents and the National Guard. Last week, in his speech to generals and other high-ranking military officials, Trump demanded loyalty while threatening to essentially wage war on American streets against Americans. So far, we've seen this play out with troops in the streets of LA, DC, and Memphis, as well as further orders for them to deploy in Chicago, Portland, and throughout Louisiana. For more on the historical precedents for what we're seeing now, I'd like to invite you to check out the live stream teach-in that we hosted on October 8th with our friends at Historians for Peace and Democracy. It's called Troops in the Street, What Does an Authoritarian Takeover Look Like? And features historians Barbara Ransby and Barbara Weinstein. There will be a link to that in the show notes if you'd like to watch it. But this long history of immigration enforcement in this country is also a worthwhile thread to pull as we work to identify ways to protect communities, resist ICE terror, and prevent further harm. Joining me to discuss the current moment in context is the program director at Detention Watch Network, Stacy Suh. They're a national coalition building power through collective advocacy, grassroots organizing, and strategic communications to abolish immigration detention in the United States. We spoke earlier this week. Have a listen. Stacy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Some of our listeners are probably a little familiar with your work at Detention Watch Network, but could you give us a little background on how the organization was founded and also how you've been adapting to the emerging conditions in this second Trump administration?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So Detention Watch Network is a national coalition working to end immigration detention in the U.S. through advocacy, storytelling, and organizing. We were founded in 1997 with various legal service providers as well as organizing groups that are working to protect immigrants in the aftermath of some of the horrific laws that passed in the 1990s, including the crime bill, as well as some other bills that really merged the criminal legal system and the immigration system that really led to more people being targeted for detention and deportation. And so the network has been around for, almost 30 years now and has been working tirelessly to protect immigrants from detention and deportation. It's been a really difficult 10 months at this point. And I think it's an understatement. I think, the Trump administration is using every tool at its disposal to target as many people as possible in every area of public life. And so what we're seeing is just an unimaginable scope and scale of detention expansion that is tearing apart so many families from their community, from their loved ones. It's been hard and it's been heavy. And I think what's been really powerful to see at the same time is more people are seeing the violence that was being carried out by ICE and CBP before the Trump administration took office. And we're seeing it at a much larger scale and scope and in very public ways, because part of the spectacle of inflicting violence on our immigrant neighbors is part of the mass detention and deportation agenda. And so I think folks have had to, really adapt a lot to these changing conditions. So a lot of the more effective strategies are hyperlocal, really responding to the conditions in the community, understanding how ICE, as well as other federal law enforcement agencies that are now acting as deportation agents, understanding the trends and figuring out what actually works at the local level. There's also been efforts at the state level to block new detention centers from opening, as well as in local communities. And so, I think folks are really trying to adapt to these changing conditions by understanding the trends, figuring out a response, and it's very hyper-specific to the conditions that folks are experiencing. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. And I mean, I think it's one of the interesting things about talking to you all is the longer memory that y'all have being founded in the 90s. And you telegraphed this a little bit, but I think this, like, the way that criminalization is has been a bipartisan project really for the past 30 years, that like there is something spectacular about what we're seeing now, and like a change in the tone and texture and intensity of what we're seeing. But I would love to talk a little bit with you about this tough on crime narrative, and how the tough on crime narrative clearly is a big piece of the puzzle, that like it is justification for the expansion of policing and prisons and detention centers. But like, are there ways that is the ways that system is being deployed now that you think are changing and shifting? And also, like, I guess draw out a little bit more about how things like the 97 crime bill have played into the way that we police migrants in this country.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think it's not a coincidence that the US not only has the largest prison system in the world, but it also has the largest detention system in the world. And it's because immigration detention operates through a wide network of local county jails, private prisons, federal prisons, and now military bases are being used more readily. And, I think during in the last few months, we are also seeing state prisons that are open to incarcerate folks in criminal custody also be used for immigration detention. And, one example of that is the Angola State Prison in Louisiana, which is notorious for horrific conditions, including, use of solitary confinement to punish people who are incarcerated. And that Camp J in particular was shut down because of those horrific conditions and the violence that had happened. And that unit is now being used for immigration detention, where, folks are experiencing medical neglect, not given their medication, and, just being treated poorly and horrifically. And as a result of that, people are organizing inside as well, where folks are staging hunger strikes, trying to get out the word about the conditions that people are enduring and experiencing. And so, I think the mass detention system here in the US cannot be understood without this, massive expansion of, the mass incarceration system. So what we see is, if we go all the way back to 1980s, where war on drugs, the tough on crime narrative was really taking root, and the number of people incarcerated in our jails and our prisons, local, state, federal levels had astronomically increased. And we also saw kind of the starting foundation of the modern detention system, where, all these racist narratives about Black and brown people were also being used to justify expanding the immigration detention system. And we see that with the Mariel boat lift crisis, the incarceration of Haitian migrants in Guantanamo, actually in the 90s. And so all of these, what we're seeing right now is not quite new, but I think what is new is kind of the consolidated scale and scope at which this is happening, and also the speed at which detention expansion is happening so quickly. I think that is unprecedented. I think we're also seeing very authoritarian tactics and strategies that are being implemented, and we see that clearly not only in immigration, but in other areas as well. But, I think what's worth noting is that people who are incarcerated have been experiencing authoritarian tactics and human rights abuses before the Trump administration ever took office. And what's unfortunate is, at the start of the Biden administration, because of the COVID pandemic, because of the border closure, due to and that they had a unique opportunity to actually reverse course and reduce the scope of the detention system. So when you look at 2021, when Biden was sworn into office, it was about 14,000 people that were in detention. A lot of people were being released because of the heightened risk of COVID inside detention. And so, you have a unique opportunity. It's the lowest number of people detained, like historically, since the expansion of the system. And we could have actually kept shrinking the system in the last 4 years. And instead, the Biden administration and the Democratic Party abandoned immigrants and turned their backs on people and really bought into this narrative of like, we need to be tough on crime, we need to be tough on the border, and really just co-signing on scapegoating of immigrants for economic insecurity and people not being able to have their basic needs met. And so, yeah, it's very frustrating, and we are in the moment we are in now. And, I think we have to be sober and honest about how we got here, but also at the same time, be able to address people's needs and mitigate the harm and violence that people are experiencing every day.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing that occurs to me is that like there's so much in that like longer story that you shared that is about kind of like what are the conditions that set up authoritarianism, what makes authoritarianism possible. And it seems to me that like the rights of migrants, like really around the world where we see like authoritarian regimes take hold, that the rights of migrants are kind of like one of the first things that are really on the chopping block. And so I'm curious, are there things that you are seeing also, especially over the last 10 months, that like are really like a bellwether for where we're headed? And why do you think that the rights of migrants are such a front line in the fight against authoritarianism right now?
Yeah, I think the attacks on immigrant communities is very much a racial justice issue because our immigration policies, detention and deportation, it's rooted in white supremacy and it's rooted in racial exclusion. And we see that with what's happening in so many communities across the country right now in Chicago, where so many federal law enforcement agencies, including ICE, CBP, and others are present to arrest and detain and deport people. And, I think it's really, it's rooted in racial profiling because you're hitting neighborhoods where it is predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. And the policy and the practice right now is to arrest people of color and then ask questions later, right? So, it really is reinforcing this racist regime to justify and dehumanize and incarcerate so many people at a mass scale. And I think the violence that is very visible right now, including the use of pepper balls to quash protests and dissent, and also just the political targeting of anyone who speaks in solidarity with immigrant communities, I think that's telling that not only is it that immigrant communities are being criminalized and targeted, but anyone who is speaking out in solidarity with immigrant communities are also being criminalized. Totally. I think what also worries me too is we're talking about expansion of third country deportations where people who are being deported to countries that they have no connection to. Right. And people who are most vulnerable for third country deportations are people with criminal convictions and also people who have some protection from being deported to their home country. And they're instead being deported elsewhere without having to be able to prove that, they are also at risk if they're deported to a third country. And so we are also seeing the offshoring of detention where, I think we've seen that very clearly with using the Alien Enemies Act, which was last invoked during World War II, and incarcerated over 120,000 Japanese Americans here in the US. That same law being invoked to, incarcerate in a mega abusive prison in El Salvador, over 200 Venezuelan folks who endured torture, sexual violence, beatings, and also the administration very proudly saying that, we also want US citizens with certain convictions to receive the same kind of treatment abroad. So I think it's telling, it's widening the window of what is acceptable or what is common and what is normal. Yeah. And I think that is really, really dangerous. And I think using the immigration status as a way to exclude people, dehumanize people, once they are, it's only going to keep getting expanded, right? And we have this massive incarceration and deportation infrastructure that is really hurting people every single day. And that should concern all of us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that stands out to me is this morning I read this piece in Reuters about how the sort of like anti-dissent machine that is being driven by Stephen Miller in the White House, that like they're thinking about basically redeploying ICE assets to aid in this, so-called counterterrorism push. That like we all know that like a lot of this is about suppressing dissent, but we've also already seen that kind of stuff being deployed against the Palestine Solidarity Movement. That like there's so many different kinds of kind of like profiling that we're starting to see and that have intensified over certainly the past 10 months, but had intensified under Biden as well in a lot of ways. I'm curious what you all are keeping track of around things like freedom of expression, around the Palestine Solidarity Movement, especially as stuff intensifies for organizers and visible spokespeople for our movements in this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we saw the detention of so many student activists as well as, academics and professors that were targeted because they spoke out against the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, that was just a clear sign that we are in authoritarianism, right? People even with, green card or have valid visas, their status is being revoked and they're using some Cold War era obscure policy to justify detaining people and harassing people. And it's a tactic of authoritarianism, but it's a tactic of intimidation. And there's been so many conversations with folks about, how do I accurately assess my risk level, understanding that, it's really difficult to do accurate risk assessment right now because the whole point of this mass deportation, mass detention agenda is that people feel like they are not safe. And it really compromises your sense of safety and security. And you can't predict what, this administration is going to do next. And so I think it's been a really challenging time. And, I think people have been actually released as they fight their case because they were criminalized for speaking out for Palestine from detention. But people are still continuing to fight their case. Some people chose to leave the country because they felt unsafe, and the risk of being detained in, horrific conditions where medical neglect is the norm, where, lack of food is the norm was too risky for folks. So people were coerced to leave. And so I think it's also really disturbing that this substantiation of authoritarian agenda is implemented to Department of Homeland Security. And it actually makes a lot of sense because after September 11, DHS was created, right? Department of Homeland Security. And the three major prongs that they have is national security, border security, and public safety. And we see how all of these different law enforcement agencies are coordinating and working together to target as many people as possible for, speaking out. And so, I think there's a lot we can do, like as organizers, as advocates, as movement, to prepare ourselves and, implement and practice good digital security. And I also think it's actually really important for all of us to continue speaking out, because while the individual risk doesn't go away, I think when more of us speak out against these kinds of authoritarian tactics, there's more collective safety in that. So, we can't guarantee anyone's security at this moment. But what we can do is each of us can do our part to make sure that we're continuing to speak out against these abuses and against authoritarianism.
Yeah, that seems extremely critical in this time. And like, I don't think we can underscore that more, that actually like, as the risks feel like they're intensifying, that like our solidarity with each other is what's going to get us through this.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious also, looking back a little bit more at Detention Watch Network's work, why you all have decided that detention is the central fight. And I know that we've talked a little bit about the physical infrastructure of detention, but what is it that detention does? And like, what is its sort of like place in this pipeline of suppressing migrant communities and suppressing speech and the intensification of deportations that we're seeing?
It's a great question. Yeah, detention plays such a crucial role in facilitating deportation. So, on the logistical end, without detention, it's extremely difficult to carry out deportations. But I think more importantly, our work to end immigration detention is about people. Detention isolates people away from their loved ones, away from their support network, and it also coerces people to sign their deportation order and stop fighting their case because of the horrific conditions that people are exposed to. And the horrific conditions like medical neglect, lack of food, also, lack of legal access, like all of those things are not new to this current landscape. But I think what is different is that so many more people are being funneled into the system. And as a result of that, the already horrific, cruel conditions that are designed to break people are worsening and are getting exacerbated because there's so many more people that are being funneled into the system. And so what's happening is people are experiencing rampant transfers where they are moved from one facility to the next. And it's scary for not only the person, but the loved ones that are supporting them, because you don't know always where the person is in the system. And there's also a lot of cases where people are deported so quickly that you don't know whether they're in the US or outside of the US. And it's a really scary feeling that I wouldn't wish on anyone, that not knowing where your loved one is and just not knowing if they're okay. And I think what's been really horrific about this massive detention expansion is that we have seen at least 21 people die just in 2025. And to put that number into context, during the 4 years of the Biden administration, at least 26 people died in ICE custody. And now we're already at 21 people who are now lost to their loved ones, to their families, to their community in just 1 year. And this year is not even over. We're in October, right?
Right.
And so the system is just, anytime anyone spends time in ICE custody is so dangerous, so deadly, detrimental to not only your physical health, but mental health. And, lives are in jeopardy anytime someone's in detention. So our work is really to prevent people from being detained in the first place, but also to make sure that people have the support they need and to uplift the work of organizing and care that people are showing each other inside detention, so that people can continue to fight their case, and also so that we can reduce the large footprint of the immigration detention system in the U.S.
Amazing. Well, let's talk a little bit about that current work. What are the current campaigns that you all are working on, and who are the key partners that you're working with in these times?
Yeah, that's a great question. Our main campaign is called the Communities Not Cages campaign. It's essentially a national campaign that connects different local campaigns to shut down detention centers or block a new detention center from opening. We have about, I think, almost 40 different local campaigns at this point that are connected to this umbrella Communities Not Cages campaign. We have so many different partners. So we have over 100 member organizations that are working in some way, shape, or form to either prevent people from being detained, to support people in detention, and also to provide support after people have been deported. And, the work looks it looks similar in that, you're bringing people together to make sure that we can actually use local resources for things that benefit everyone, like healthcare and jobs that don't rely on caging somebody. and also telling the stories of impacted people and lifting those stories up, because I think a lot of people are shocked to find out that so many people, tens of, actually hundreds of thousands of people are going through the detention system every year. And so, yeah, it's hard to name just one partner, but, there's a lot of folks that are doing work to, there's folks who are working on family detention, because that practice ended during the Biden administration, is now returned. And there's family detention happening at a mass scale as well. There's also folks who are working to shut down existing facilities and just work. And right now, I think we don't have as much of an opening to be able to win in that way. But I think part of the work that we're doing in this moment is not only supporting people, but how are we actually building in the long term, and how are we building the infrastructure so that when there is a change in our conditions, that we can actually move on it and be able to win.
Yeah, that's big. And are these local campaigns happening nationwide? Like, is this something that is found like I know that like Louisiana has come up, and we've talked with Lydia Pillow Hobbs on this show about why the like carceral system in Louisiana is such a central piece of the puzzle. But like, is this a nationwide network of folks?
Yeah, it is a nationwide network of people. And, I think what folks are doing is either forming smaller local campaigns, or a local coalition or a statewide coalition to block detention. So, I think at the local level, there's levers that could potentially be used to block or delay or disrupt a new detention center from opening. So a good example of that is, Leavenworth in Kansas, where a city is actually suing to make sure that Core Civic, a private prison company that wants to open the prison again, that was previously shuttered as an immigration detention center, to make sure that they actually go through all of the necessary steps to open, because they haven't taken any of those steps, because everywhere across the country, prison companies and ICE is moving very quickly to try to open as many detention centers as possible. There's other campaigns, like in Louisiana, as we mentioned, there is a coalition called the Southeast Dignity Not Detention Coalition that has been working for many years to provide direct support to immigrants in Louisiana's detention centers, and Florida and elsewhere as well. But also really highlighting that, these conditions are not just exceptional to one facility, but that it is systemic, because we're seeing the same patterns of abuse across the country, across the board. And while there's maybe specific abuses that show up more prominently in a particular detention facility, these are systemic abuses. So, which is why we work to advocate to end the entire system.
One of the things that you mentioned is that the Leavenworth campaign is against a for-profit prison company. That I imagine that this is a time where a lot of those companies are also chomping at the bit to make money on this intensification. And I don't know, have you seen that people's increasing awareness of immigration enforcement has led to more sensitivity or more interest in issues like who's making money on this?
Yeah, I think there's been more scrutiny for sure on, private prison companies that benefit. And it's not just the actual prison or the detention itself, but it's also about transportation, phone calls, commissary. There's a wide network of companies that are profiting from people being incarcerated. And I think what we have to get to the root of is that there are perverse financial incentives that drive mass incarceration, that are also adding to mass detention. And I think also, I don't want to overemphasize also the private aspect of it, because it is public taxpayer dollars that are going to these private prison companies, right? It's also what's complicated, or what's challenging sometimes too, is that there are local governments with shrinking budgets that are looking to backfill their budget. And so, sometimes localities will be like, oh, we need more jobs for our community. So if we allow this company to open a detention facility in our community that will actually help improve the lives of our residents here. And you know what's true, what's not, that so there's this myth about, opening a detention center benefits the local economy. And what we found over time is that is simply not true. People who local economies actually don't benefit, and they actually are hurting from having a detention center, because it basically forecloses other economic opportunities that might have been more beneficial to that particular town. It also, I think I can't understate the human impact of having a prison in a town looks like. And I think that's actually very well exemplified in Leavenworth. Some of the people that were opposing the facility from reopening were former correctional officers that also saw the violence inside and the current conditions inside. And we also know that rates of, suicide as well as rates of domestic violence among correctional officers is much higher, like many, many times higher. And so, violence has this ripple effect, right? Violence is learned. And so when you have a massive detention system where violence is the norm, that is by design, it not only impacts people who are incarcerated and detained, it also impacts anyone who is in close proximity, including people, incarcerated folks' loved ones. And so, yeah, I mean, and I think what the work we need to do is, not just talking about immigration detention as an immigrant rights issue, but it's a racial justice issue. It's actually an environmental justice issue, because prisons are often built on areas where there's more likely to be flooding or other environmental disasters. And, thinking about, how do we actually create an economy that doesn't rely on caging people, and instead, what would it actually look like to invest billions of dollars that's going to ICE and CBP right now to carry out a mass detention and deportation agenda? What would it look like to take that $170 billion to something that can actually benefit everyone? And so I think that those are the questions that we need to keep asking and pushing, and make the case that, detention actually hurts everyone, not just immigrants.
Yeah. And it's so much damn money.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
Yeah. I also wonder, it's probably, I think, certainly for a lot of our listeners, and I'm sure from day to day in your work, that this may be a difficult question to answer sometimes. But what are the opportunities to build right now and build power? One of the things that I tell myself constantly these days is there is a moment beyond this moment. The world will continue, right? And as we try to go up the gears of these really, really violent processes that are playing out in front of us, we do have to be thinking about that moment beyond this moment. So how are you all thinking about that? What are you building towards? And what are the things that you're sort of holding in mind as you're thinking about, what is the power that we're going to need tomorrow to really transform this system and change the way that the immigration system works in this country?
Yeah, that's a great question. What can people do, right? And actually, there's a lot that we can all do, and so I think it's important for all of us to, do what we can to protect immigrant communities from our lane and from our unique lens and contribution. So if you're in labor, for example, there's so much you can do to work to make sure that workplaces have folks in workplaces are trained up to say ICE cannot enter a workplace without a warrant. I think there's also power in unions and worker rights organizations taking proactive steps to do individual risk assessment of members who are going to be more vulnerable. There's a lot of work happening to adopt a day laborers corner, so having more of a community presence so that folks who are seeking work are not particularly vulnerable to ICE enforcement. So I think that's one thing. The other piece in terms of building for the long run and building power is, I just keep going back to Ella Baker's spade work, this concept of doing the work day in and day out, talking to people, actually getting folks to take small actions and towards a big goal. And I think there's this desire that like, if I do this one thing, like we will end authoritarianism,
Right.
or we can protect immigrant communities. I think it's very alluring to be like, if we do this one thing, we can actually win. And what we know is that we actually have to do a lot of different things at a lot of different levels, small scale, medium scale, large scale, to be actually able to win. And so I think part of it is, education and, understanding how the system operates and clearly diagnosing like why we are, like, how do we get here? Why are we here? And what are points of intervention that we can participate in? So I think that education is important. And, I think my organization, Detention Watch Network, does a lot of trainings. We put together a lot of resources to help people understand how the system operates so that, they can most effectively actually fight against all of these cruel systems that are tearing apart families every day. I think the other part about building power is, I think joining an organization is actually really important. And I also understand that a lot of frontline organizations are really strained right now because they're experiencing so much interest. It takes work to train, onboard, and bring folks in to do the work. And so I think, being patient with yourself if you're like newer to this work as you're learning, but also you can start small too. So do you know your neighbors? Do you talk to them? Do you, and building relationships on a block to block level, I think that kind of organizing where you're talking to people, understanding what their concerns are, what their needs are, and figuring out a solution together. I think that work is so critical for us to be able to build power in the long run, because we're not always like talking to each other. And I think there's sometimes a conflation of activism and organizing. We definitely need both. But if we're gonna win, we actually need to organize, and we also need to, and we can do both, but we actually need to build deep, trusting relationships to be able to do the hard, difficult things. And, I think there's so many ways that people can get involved to help protect immigrant communities. There's accompaniment teams where you can get trained to show up to court or someone's ICE check-in with them so that they feel more, supported, and you can also help document whatever is happening. There's also ICE Watch programs that you can build at your neighborhood level to ensure that actually what the activities of ICE and federal law enforcement agencies look like. There's also so many anti-expansion fights. We're actively trying to block detention centers from opening, and this is critical because what we've seen is that areas with detention centers have higher rates of ICE arrest because it's so much easier for ICE to arrest and detain people in an area where there's a ton of detention capacity. So it's important for us to thwart their every move, their every step. And so really encourage folks to also join a local Communities Not Cages campaign and figure out, how you can get involved. It could be fundraising, or it could be, visitation and, seeing folks who are detained to be able to provide emotional support and learn from their experiences.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. If people want to find out more about some of these campaigns and get involved with Detention Watch Network's work, where would you send them? Where should people go?
You should please visit our website at detentionwatchnetwork.org.
Well, thank you so much, Stacy. Are there other things that we missed? There are things about your work that you want to share with our listeners that maybe we missed?
I mean, I think just that, I firmly believe that we will win. I think our work right now is to make sure that, people are, we mitigate the violence and the harm that people are experiencing. So thinking about like, what can I do? What can I take action? How can I contribute to help protect our immigrant neighbors and friends who are, in really dire situation right now? So I think we actually have the power. And I think the part of the quashing and targeting of activists and dissent is to make us feel like we don't have the power. And I think we need to fully step into our power and do everything possible, however small, however big, to make sure that we can protect each other.
It's amazing. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you today. Take care. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
My thanks again to Stacy for joining me today. You can find ways to connect with Detention Watch Network in the show notes. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Editorial help this week came from Akin Allah. Kimmy David designed our cover art. I also want to give big thanks and a shout out this week to our friends at the Real News Network, especially studio director David Hebden, for setting me up in their really nice studio in Baltimore this week. And finally, if you've got something to say, please drop me a line. You can send me an email that we'll consider running on an upcoming mailbag episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. And of course, if you would like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.